I think that is really at the heart of my work is challenging those boxes, challenging those binaries, challenging those borders, who I think are very artificial and very questionable.
Content warnings for this episode include ableism, sanism, and cisnormativity, transmisia, and trauma. Jennifer would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and the unceded lands that the producers, hosts, and guests have lived and dwelt upon. Today both of us honor the Ojibwa and Dakota lands. We honor the elders, the human, plant, and animal ancestors of these lands and celebrate the living descendants of these people. May all beings tend these lands for the goodness of the next 7 generations and beyond.
Miati folks, welcome to Genderful, a talk show interviewing gender-diverse folks about their special interests.
The name of our show celebrates that gender expansiveness is wonderful.
Hi, I'm Gender Meowster, and my pronouns are they, them.
Hi, I'm Atlas of Phoenix, and my pronouns are also they, them. The focus of our show is to interview trans, non-binary, agender, and gender-diverse people regarding their special interests, passion projects, and resources for the gender-diverse community.
We want our audience to know that this show is hosted by 2 folks who also identify as non-binary, transmasculine, neurodivergent, and disabled, with the passion for telling trans stories.
We invite you to remember that we are whole people with robust lives, friendships, challenges, and successes. We love and are loved, and we are delighted to share these stories with you.
As always, we kindly remind our listeners that no person is a monolith of their identities. Your identities can change over time and are valid every step of the way. And if you think you're gender diverse, you are gender diverse. There are no social or medical prerequisites to be included in the community.
Welcome to Genderful episode 87. This week, our guest, Alex Iantaffi, they, them, is chatting with us about neurodivergence, gender, and sexuality. Alex is an author, public speaker, therapist, and host of the show Gender Stories Podcast. Welcome to Genderful, Alex.
Well, thank you so much for having me on Genderful. I'm so nervous and so excited to be here.
I'm nervous and excited too. So we're of 2 of the same feather, I guess. So
Good
it's
company.
Good company. Oh, this is perfect. All right. I just want to shoot off with this first question, but I do want to thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to interviewing you today. I wish Gender could be here as well, and I'm sure they do too. So thanks for coming through. Let's see. The first question I want to ask is the question we ask everybody first, which is, what might be some things that you can trace back to your youth that indicated that you might be gender diverse one day?
Yeah, I love that question. Well, I remember, there's a lot of photos of me dressed like a little boy when I was young. I always loved having really short hair. And I know those are kind of very stereotypical things, but bear in mind that I was born very early in the 70s in Italy. And so kind of always wearing short hair was definitely not gender typical when I was growing up. And I also remember kind of how happy I was if people thought I was a boy. Say that I was like playing in the park and like other little kids were like, what's your name? And I used Alex, which is a diminutive of my given name for forever. So I would use that, which is kind of gender neutral. And people would assume I was a boy. And that made me really happy. I didn't know what that meant, of course. I just knew that it made me happy. And even when I was like in my teenage years, my dad would take me to the barbers to get my hair cut, which was definitely not typical in kind of the 70s and 80s. And I remember just the feeling of gender euphoria at having the haircut that I wanted. And even on the bus, if people thought I was a boy because they were behind me, and then I would speak and they were like, oh, I'm sorry. I was like, no, it's great. I feel great when people think I'm a boy. And it took me a minute to realize that not every other teenage girl, which is how I was presenting and thought I was at the time, would be euphoric of being taken as a boy, And so those are just kind of some little points. And when I look back and saw those photos, I'm like, how could people not see it? I do look like a little boy, right? There are photos when I'm like 6 or 7 years old. And even when I'm wearing a dress, I look like I'm in drag. Genuinely, like I have a photo of me in a like super cute pink dress, and then in one of those little cars, like a kid's car on the carousel at the park, and I'm like, stretching my stuff like I'm a dude. at like 6 years old. So those are just a few moments. Yeah.
That's when you've got the confidence at 6 to do that kind of thing.
Right. I
Now
think
you
my
need
confidence has
wingmen.
been going down since then. But yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think like when we're 6, we know ourselves,
Mhm.
although we don't know anything at all. And I feel like I'm desperately trying to get back to that. One of my favorite things was a fortune cookie that I got that I'm going to read now. It's upside down in a frame. And that's what I like about it, because it was supposed to be right side up. But when I
Nice.
turn it around, it was upside down. And it says, "A truly great person never puts away the simplicity of a child."
Love,
And
that's
that's
beautiful.
right. And then when it, like the fact that it's upside down makes it even better. So I was like, "Oh, you should fix that." I'm like, "No, you're missing the point."
I
How
love
has your
that.
Yes, right? How has your relationship to gender evolved over time?
Oh, so much, and I feel it hasn't even been done evolving, which I know it's weird to say. What I know, I'm in my 50s now,
Mhm.
but I feel first of all, I'm been always fascinated by gender. I've realized, as a late diagnosed neurodivergent person, that gender and humans generally are my special interest. And so gender never made a lot of sense to me, right? Even when I was a little kid or a teenager, I was like, there's something suspect in a concept that can be so easily manipulated, or it can, if I change my haircut or the way I dressed or the way I behaved, people would read me as a completely different gender. And so I always knew there was something suspect about this idea that there are always only two genders, and that there are things that we're supposed to do that align with our gender assigned at birth. And then, of course, that was my understanding as like a kid and an adolescent. And then I went on to do a PhD in what we would now call gender studies. But at the time, it was still called women's studies, which again ages me quite a bit. And because I was so fascinated by this idea of gender and what it meant, and there was some sense inside me that I didn't really quite fit what people expected of me because of my gender. And I couldn't quite make sense of it, right? For a long time, I tried to come at it from a very feminist perspective. It's because of misogyny, and I have to just love myself harder, right? My paternal aunt, so my dad's sister, was a feminist in the 70s and 80s. And so she gave me all this feminist literature. And of course, this was still very much second wave feminism, right? So I was like, this is just internalized self-hatred, that I'm kind of more leaning more towards masculinity. And so really worked on kind of celebrating my femininity, celebrating womanhood, and it just was never enough, And so eventually I really came to this realization that I was genderqueer, and then eventually kind of came out as trans as well as genderqueer. But my understanding of gender has always been pretty fluid. I think it's just the level at which I've been able to critically engage with what gender is. It's changed over time, of course. And I feel like it's still changing. Every time I talk to somebody who has a gender identity that's different from mine, for example, I learn so much. I've learned so much from my trans feminine siblings, for example, right? In the last 20 years being in community with other trans folks, I've learned so much from people who have grown up like here in the US rather than me in Italy, right? And how different our experiences are. And so I think that for me, my understanding of gender, my own, but also the social cultural aspect of gender, is forever evolving. I don't know that there's ever an end point, right?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's an endpoint
Yeah.
for myself either, and I'm making a movie about my transition and mental health journey. And, I'm the more I dive into it, the more I start looking at footage that I've shot, I just feel like, yeah, you're onto something that actually sort of demystifies the whole process. And this show, that Gender Biaster put together is a big key part of that too, and I haven't listened to your show Gender Stories, but I imagine it's the same thing too. Like we're all questioning what is the point of gender.
Exactly. And why put all those limitations on one another, right?
Right.
And I learned myself even from my own kids who are cisgender, but like my oldest, my daughter, and the stories I share always with our consent, for example, really taught me like how hard it is if you are a girl who both loves like science and math and technology, and is also very feminine, for example, that there is an incompatibility, right, in a way, and feeling that pressure of being one thing or another. And then thankfully, having been brought up in a household full of queer people, really questioning all those kind of expectations that people put on her and finding a way to be herself. But I think that the gender binary hurts everybody, obviously in very different ways, but I think it is pretty painful for everybody.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. It's just, like I recently finished a film called Ordinary, and I question identities of all kind. And I cover all the identities that I supposedly have that have been linked to my DNA, but also have been thrust on me by society. And, my only thing is like, I just want to exist and feel joy and be happy. And, part of that means like kind of dipping out of society for a while and just figuring out what makes me happy. So, yeah, so thanks for sharing that. It sounds like one heck of a journey that you've been on these last, was it 52 years now?
Yeah, 52 years. And I feel like I'm still on it. And
Yeah,
who
same.
knows where I'll be, hopefully, if I get a few more years, who know where I'll be in a few more years and what I'll think
Right.
of my gender or gender in general. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm 52 as well. I hopefully turn 53 in November. And so it's like, you know, I'm just, I was recounting the other day that I've always been happy. I've just had things that have gotten in the way that have been serious stressors and created trauma that have left me having to deal with these things. But my natural state is happiness and joy, and it's like
Yeah.
surrounding yourself with people that also have that natural state space and that they're not performative about it, because it seems to mean that they still have some work to do. And it's just like, that's fine. Everybody's got work to do. I have work to do. It's just a matter of like, is your luggage compatible and that kind of thing, so you don't take on other people's luggage and other people's issues, because it becomes codependent at that point. And then you lose yourself taking care of other people too, and that can happen a lot, particularly in the trans community, where people can kind of lose themselves taking care of other people, so that they don't necessarily have to take care of themselves. And that's something that doesn't really get talked a lot about, because it's, again, rocking the boat to have these conversations. But it starts with, how has your relationship to gender evolved over time? And that's a big, heavy question to think about, at least once every 6 months.
Absolutely.
So thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Let me switch topics here. Neurodivergence, gender, and sexuality. How does your cultural background intersect with and or affect your gender experience?
Yeah, that's another great question. In so many ways, for example, being brought up in Italy in the 70s and 80s, like nobody ever kind of thought it was super weird if I was like holding hands with my friends who were the same gender that I was perceived as at the time, right? And I know that gender and sexuality are two different things, but they're also kind of connected, right, in some
Yes.
ways. And
Mhm.
and so things like being really like affectionate and close and holding hands and going to the bathroom together with your girlfriends, in air quotes, because that's how it was perceived at the time, wasn't seen as anything gay or queer, for example. And also even the fact that, I liked going to the barber and having my hair cut short. It was like, that's just what Alex does. There wasn't any meaning given to it.
Mhm.
And I think in a way that gave me a freedom when I was growing up to explore what I felt comfortable with.
Mhm.
I even joined the Boy Scouts at the experimental all gender troop when I was like what would be middle school, early high school. And so I
Mhm.
joined that troop, and it was like an all gender troop. And that was another really wonderful experience for me. And so there's
Wow.
some ways in which I had a freedom, which sometimes I wonder, if I've been brought up like in the US or the UK, where I lived for like 15 years in my 20s and very early 30s, like would that have been different? You know what I mean? If I've been picked
Yeah.
on at school, I got picked on for other reasons, but not
Mhm.
around gender and sexuality stuff. And so in a way that spared me also from some trauma, that I see people who have been picked on and bullied from a young age for their gender expression, I think that spared me that trauma in some ways, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And yeah, that's a huge piece for me. You know, it wasn't until I was in my early 20s and I was living in the UK. And my best friend came to visit and we were holding hands going around Covent Garden and somebody called us dykes. And that had never happened to me before. And my friend is also very straight. But, you know, we were both like so shocked because it was not an experience we ever had in Italy. Right. And I had just been living in the UK for like a few months at the time. I was like 22. It would be another couple of years before I came to terms with my own sexuality and started coming out as queer. And so if that had happened when I was like 10, 12, 15, right? How would that have impacted me? And of course, I don't know because I didn't live that reality. But I think I truly believe that was because of the cultural context when I was brought up in, if that makes sense.
It does.
On the other hand, also my mom is from Sicily and we spent a lot of time there because that's the only vacations we had was going to see my great aunts. I also internalized a lot of misogyny, right? There were very strict expectations around gender, you know, keep your legs together. You don't sit like that. Ladies don't sit like that, right? All these expectations, put other people's needs first, right? What will people think if you walk around with a boy because my great aunts lived in a village and everybody would know. If I walked around the square with a boy without anybody else, by the time I got home, my great aunts would know that had happened and I would get a talking to, right? And I remember, and also I was brought up Catholic. So lots of really misogynistic ideas about gender from the pulpit. You know, in terms of priests. And so that also had an impact, of course. So it's complicated, right? There were ways in which there was kind of a freedom and of expression, and there were other ways in which there was a lot of oppression and kind of a pretty tight gender box in some ways.
Yes, you said that you didn't have that experience as a teen or preteen of being called a dyke or gay or any of those things that you know people are trying to figure out their own sexuality, but instead of focusing on taking care of themselves, they'd rather ID you, and you know that ID doesn't necessarily fit. And I did have that experience myself here in the States, and it was just like everyone in high school was like, you know, don't talk to you know this person because they're gay, and I'm just like, I don't even, what is gay? What does that really mean? You know, but I remember being something like 7 or 8 or something, and David Bowie had just dropped Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
Yes.
And my mom was like, David Bowie's bisexual. And I was like,
right?
David Bowie's bisexual so much. I didn't even know what bisexual was, but I just thought, if it looks like this, then I'm totally bisexual. You know what I mean?
I do, because I mean, David Bowie, Prince, in Italy, Renato Zero, right? Those were the people I watched, and I was like, that is me. Even though they were like, right? I was like, I see me, like I see that gender expression, right? And it was so exciting during those times, right? And I was like, I was like you, I was like, I don't even know fully what that means, but there seems to be so much freedom and expansion in this. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I started listening to Prince in 1979 and miraculously came to Minneapolis and started working for her. You know, like I think it was like 15 years later or something like that. And it was a great experience. But you know, when you're up close like that, it's different. It's different than looking at a poster or listening to an album when you're like, you know, like my little story is of having an interaction with him that another bandmate had brought him over to me. And we were just casually talking and hanging out. And it was like he was just chill and he wasn't like Prince. He was just this guy that everyone was fussing around and trying to get the video up and going and make the music video. And he said he needed a glass. And I was just like, oh, okay. And we were at a set. And there was like glasses behind me. I was at a bar and they were sitting in the stools on the other side. And I said, oh, I'll get you a glass, sir. So I turn around and I go to grab a martini glass and they're all like glued together. And then, you know, I'm holding the glass and I'm just like, he can totally see what you're doing. So can Morris. Just turn around and admit it, and then offer to get a glass from the kitchen, which is exactly what I did. I was very cool about it. And he just chuckled and said, no, that's okay. You know, and it was just like that moment of like seeing him on a poster and then seeing him in real life and then having that moment and just being like, when he passed away, you know, like I think I cried for 2 or 3 days straight, and the
Yeah.
whole world turned purple from Sydney to, you know, Alaska, all over the world,
Mhm.
you know, and it's still a thing that we do April 21st, you know, I think more
Yeah.
so than his birthday, June 7th. But yeah, like looking at these people just be themselves, you know, both of them ironically died the same year within months of each
Mhm.
other. It's just like, it was pretty powerful because they really smashed a lot of the whole premise around gender. And then it
Yeah.
gave us, people like us, a voice to do the same thing too, which gets passed down to millennials, Gen Zers, and Gen Alpha. And I feel like by the
Mhm.
time we get to Gen Beta, a lot of this stuff just won't be an issue anymore, you know?
Absolutely.
And
Already, I feel like Gen Z has such a different idea of gender than
oh yeah,
we did as Gen Xers, you know.
oh
Mhm.
yeah, definitely, definitely. And the freedom to admit their emotions, the way that as
Yeah.
Generation Xers we didn't have, you know, it's just like
Oh,
if you
yeah.
look at the movie Breakfast Club, it really tells a lot about our generation where we're just too cool for school, you know, and it's just like no, we actually need to feel our feelings, which is what we're doing now. Like we're going to therapy and we're like doing all this stuff now that our millennial friends and Gen Zer friends are doing now, you know. So it's just we're building that arc so that we can be stronger together, and I think that's beautiful. And this is a perfect
Yeah.
segue into this because I also happened to find out that I had ADHD and autism last year. And so my question for you is, tell us your story about getting diagnosed with ADHD later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes. um, yes, I was like, oh, where do I begin? Because my brain was going into so many different directions when you were talking. You know, I went
Oh,
back, which is very, right, very ADHD. I was like, yes,
yes.
I remember when I watched Purple Rain for the first time. And now I'm remembering when like Prince died and I know exactly where I was. You know, People's Movement Center was still a thing. I was at
Yeah.
work and I found out in between clients. And I remember sitting outside, you know, and on the little step and crying, you know, and
Yes.
then having to pull it
Sobbing.
together because I had a client afterwards, you know. So my brain is like going in all these different directions, including
Right.
and what you said about feelings. I was like, oh yes, and now and that was one of my issues that I was always so direct and blunt,
Yes.
which I now understand was part of my neurodivergence,
Mhm.
and I was officially diagnosed with autism with the ADHD with strong autistic traits or whatever that means. But
Yeah.
and I'm not pursuing kind of a further diagnosis, but everybody
Mhm.
around me is like, yeah, autism and ADHD are like hand in hand for you.
Yes.
You know,
And for trans folks too.
oh my God. And it explains so much
Mhm.
about everything, about gender, about my interactions with people,
Mhm.
about the way I was picked on in school for being so unfiltered, you know, in a
Right.
lot of ways.
Thinking
And
outside the box.
yes, that
That's really what it is. It's like I don't understand. I don't even know what a box is. Why would you put me in a box? And we had a guest a few months ago that
yes,
was just like, you know, be yourself and don't put yourself in a box. And I was like, yeah, boxes are for shoes. You know, free the souls, and that's kind of it. And it's just like I don't understand why people would want to put themselves in a box. I don't want to be in a box unless I die, and I'd actually like to be cremated. So just put me in a fancy jar and put me on somebody's mantle, and we'll be fine. You know. And so yeah, I don't know.
no, I'm with you. And I'm such a Pisces with Cancer rising. I'm like, when I die, just put me in the ground, you know, encompass me, and then I can be part of everything with the fungi, you know. But
Did
it's
you
like,
say you were a Pisces with the Pisces rising?
yeah, with Cancer rising, so
With
much
Cancer
water.
rising. So much
Yes,
water. Yeah,
so
I'm a
much water.
Scorpio with a Libra rising. So
Oh,
I feel like the Libra takes the edge off the Scorpio, which is nice because I have ADHD and autism. I might be too much for people that are in boxes. So yes.
I'm definitely too much for people who are in boxes like constantly. And, you know, I've tried to make myself smaller, especially moving to the UK in my 20s, feeling that was like so much, you know, which was so weird because in Italy, I was like seen as an introvert. And then I moved to
Mhm.
the UK when I was 22, you know, and people were like, you're so rude and you're so extroverted. And I was like, what? This is news to me.
Mhm.
You know, and then think about the cultural context. But going back to your original question, which was about my late diagnosis, what happened
Mhm.
was actually that I was experiencing a lot of brain fog.
Mhm.
I also have physical disabilities, I have a connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I had a
Mhm.
spontaneous cerebrospinal fluid leak. which has now been repaired, thankfully. But I was having a lot of kind of different issues and brain fog, and my doctor put me on Strattera, which is a medication for ADHD, but it also has off-label use for brain fog. And so she put me on this low dose of Strattera, and suddenly a lot of things that have been challenging for me historically started to get easy. And my partner was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if you find out that you have ADHD? Haha, kind of moment. And then, exactly. And then I was talking to a couple of friends and they were like, yeah, friend, you have ADHD, right? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, what do you see? And I feel so not aware when I tell the story, because I'm like, dear God, I'm a therapist with so much experience, including working with neurodivergent folk, which I've always been like, I wonder why so many of my clients are neurodivergent and somehow we like understand each other, right? And so a couple of my colleagues look at me and they're like, you're like the poster child of ADHD. You're always like, have too many projects going on, overly committed. You have no idea how much time things take. And you're always like, you know, trying to scramble, doing all the things. And I was like,
you felt called out, didn't you?
I totally felt called out. I was also like, why didn't anybody tell me? And then I told my oldest, who just basically was like, yeah, duh, when you're on your phone, really difficult to get you to do anything else or to pay attention to anything else. Anyway, so basically I was like, oh, maybe there's something in this. I thought about it, talked about it with my therapist, decided eventually to go for an assessment, not because self-diagnosis is not valid, but because my doctor was like, if you have ADHD, I can increase your medication when we need to, but I need the diagnosis to be like an official diagnosis first. And so I went for a neuropsych assessment, got my ADHD diagnosis, and with the strong autistic traits, but also the psychologist who did the assessment was like, Alex, you've been masking so well for 50 years that like, if you want, we can like dive deeper to see if there's also autism. But all I can tell you is that like, you definitely have a very neurodivergent like profile and you're scoring pretty high in kind of that autism quotient scale that they use. And you definitely have ADHD. And it was such a turning point for me. And I'm still coming to terms with that in some ways, right? That was it's coming up to a year from the official diagnosis. And so I still feel like I'm digesting. Yeah, it was May 2022 when I got diagnosed.
Mine was March 18th.
Okay, this is like spooky. Like
stop being me. Go be yourself.
I know. This is like so, like the same age, same region. Other like I was like, how did this happen? It's blowing my mind.
Just so the audience knows, we had this discussion during the pre-show, which is, if you notice, I'm wearing a Protect Trans Youth shirt, and Alex was like, oh, I have a shirt just like that. And I was like, no, you don't. You don't live in Minnesota. You live in Italy, because I didn't know. I was like, this shirt was made by someone who lives in South Minneapolis. What are you talking about? And then eventually we found out that we live in the same state and that they were also going to wear the same shirt today, but they wore it yesterday. And I said, hey, you have 20 minutes. You can change if you want to. So we were going to be the Doublemint twins, but it didn't work out. So here we are, the same person interviewing each other. If you have a baseball cap, you're free to go get it.
Hey, this is Jacko from Stealth, the Transmasculine Podcast. Check out our show, which focuses on the stories of trans men who transitioned before or around the year 2000. Come listen to Jason, who transitioned in 1968, or Jude, who's turning 83 this year. Listen to men of color share their experiences of transitioning into their authentic selves. You can find us on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other streaming platforms, or on our website, transmasculinepodcast.com.
I do have a question from Kamesy, who wants to know, is there anything around gender psychology when you were studying or starting out as a therapist?
Yeah,
that's a great question.
Yes. Anything at all, or just like, I'm just making sure. This is where my autism shows. I'm making sure I understand the question.
Oh, no, I understand. There doesn't seem to be anything, and it just says anything around. So there isn't anything specific, just anything in general.
Yeah, I think that, generally what I noticed when I decided to become a psychotherapist, which was after I did my PhD, actually. So I'd already really been studying gender quite a bit. Was that we had all this absurd, quite frankly, gender rules when it comes to psychology, right? All the tests are normed according to a binary way, right?
Wow.
If you take a psychological test, it's like, this is how it's normed for men and for women, right? And of course, the baseline is not just cisgender, but it's also white. It's also, not disabled generally. It's usually straight. And so the baseline didn't really fit my experience at all. And even when people were trying to come up with models, like I remember we were so excited that we were having our first gay systemic psychotherapist was coming to talk to us about same gender families. And he presented this model. And I was like, well, this model doesn't fit for me. I'm bisexual. And he was like, well, you just adapt it to whatever gender you're partnered with. And I was like, well, I'm also polyamorous. And then he was like, well, now you're just being difficult. And I was like, I'm not being difficult. I'm just telling you that your model, your box doesn't fit my life. And so you can't say that this is going to suit everybody, and it just got really upset at PC.
I mean, it's sad because the floor on that model is completely broken. What if a lot of those people were trans? What if they were non-binary, but there wasn't a language? So the statistics that this test is based off of are actually false.
Exactly. Well, and that is part of it. Is misleading, and that's part of the issue. Historically, I've also worked for a university-based gender clinic, which used a very different approach to what I use now, where they did a lot of psychological testing. And I think it was really problematic because none of those tests were really normed for trans and or non-binary people, and in a way, being non-binary or even being a certain kind of queer as a trans person kind of put a question mark on your identity for some psychologists. And so the whole field was really challenging. I'm really grateful that I trained as a systemic psychotherapist where there was more appreciation of social and cultural norms and systems of power and oppression. Whereas I feel in psychology, that is still historically not what has happened. And I think that the field overall is still very much struggling with being inclusive. But yeah, there's so much to be said about gender and psychology that could go on and on, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor.
This is great because another question came up related to this question, which was Kamsi wondered how the field has accommodated gender diversity. And before you answer that, it can link to this other question in addition, which is, are you familiar with ADHD gender? This is a term used in some online communities defined as a gender so heavily influenced by ADHD that one's ADHD and one's experience of gender cannot be unlinked.
Yes, and yes. Oh my God, so many feelings. I am familiar with the term, and I do feel that over the past year, I have re-examined my gender through a neurodivergent lens anyway, of both ADHD and autism. I also really connect with the word autigender nowadays, which is where the experience of autism and gender are closely linked. So same principle. But honestly, for me, that understanding is still in progress because, I'm so new to seeing myself as a neurodivergent person and as a AUDHDer that I'm really still processing what that means and reviewing so many experiences in my past and going, oh, that makes sense. That's why those boxes never felt comfortable. And I always questioned all boxes, honestly. Even as a Catholic, I was like, is there a hell? I don't think so, which got me in a lot of trouble. And Sunday school, I was like, questionable, I was like, if we
you were at Sunday school in Italy and you asked that and you said that?
Yeah, I was like, I don't think there's a hell. And they were like, what? And I was like, let's really see what Jesus was saying. Like how, I was like, if we take the message in the gospel seriously, I don't understand how there could be a hell, that those were conversations didn't go super well. But as you can imagine.
Yes, I mean, I do imagine because lately I've been floating around in my brain where everyone's, talking about like they're using the Bible to politicize it so they can make these laws or whatever. And I'm like, I had to read the Bible because I was doing a video project for someone and I needed to be able to write the quotes correctly. That's my extent of reading the Bible. And so the show was maybe 45 minutes long. So that gives you an idea of how much I read. And I'm like, basically the story of Jesus that I've heard and some of the little things that I've read in this great tissuey book is that, the one message, if it's like on a tablet that Moses or somebody's carrying, it's like, don't be a patootie. Just be a decent person. And that's
Right?
really it.
It's just good manners and love your neighbors. As one of my my elders friends is like, it's just good manners. That's
like,
yeah.
Don't go over and mow somebody else's grass unless they can't do it themselves and they've specifically asked you. But don't go run your tractor over on somebody else's lawn. Just mind your own business. Be cool. Be chill. And
Exactly.
just respect people, even if you don't understand me. Because I don't fit in your box, just respect me and respect that my life is just as valuable and valid as yours, and that I deserve to breathe in this oxygen and walk my own path, like Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Jesus and Nelson Mandela. You know what I mean? So just live my life.
Exactly.
Ugh,
Yeah. No, there's so much about so many feelings, so much about Catholicism that was very questionable and that did question because I was very into the church. I wanted to be a nun. I was knee deep in kind of Bible studies. And I was always like, why convert people? I think that all religions are valid. They're just like, different ways to understand divinity. Again, did not go great with the nuns and priests around me, as you can imagine.
Just a little bit.
Exactly. But sometimes I feel like psychology is just as bad as the Catholic Church. You know what I mean? I was like, okay, the Catholic Church was like, it's about religion and this dogma. But I feel like in psychology, there's also a lot of dogma, going back to the question the person was asking. I feel in a way, the field of psychology and mental health, in some cases, wants to embrace gender diversity and expansiveness. But I don't think that we're doing that very well as a field yet at all. I think there is still an othering. I think that most therapists, most cisgender therapists are still more comfortable having trans and non-binary clients rather than colleagues. And some of them are definitely not comfortable having colleagues who are more senior than they are, in my experience. And for me, that's cisgenderism, right? That's transphobia, cisgenderism. And so I think that even though the field has good intentions, there is like a underlining, a veiled thing that we are other if we're trans, non-binary, or gender diverse, and we are other, and we are objects of study, not subjects, right? I think it's changing as more and more trans and non-binary people enter the field, do the research, become therapists. I'm like 20 years older than most of the trans and non-binary therapists and psychologists who are doing amazing work in the field nowadays, and
they're doing amazing work.
To be younger. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're doing amazing work because they're being driven by their neurodiversity. Neurodiversity makes you think outside the box. So in order to do that and to be effective as a therapist, you're going to need neurodivergency to make that happen. I mean, honestly, otherwise it's the same board that won't pass complex post-traumatic stress disorder because they don't have enough details to make it valid. I'm like, it's totally valid.
Oh my God. And it's absurd. The complex PTSD, not only it's a diagnosis I have and that I also work with a lot of clients, is like, it's so clear to me, like everything we know about developmental trauma and complex PTSD. I'm like, how is this not? I mean, we can also question the whole idea of diagnosis in itself because that's another box. But I was like, how are people still pushing against this? Makes zero sense. But, dominant academia makes zero sense to me, which is why eventually I got out. But yeah.
I understand that. That's a great, perfect segue for this because we have all these other juicy topics about here to talk about concerning you. You've written and are co-written several books and zines. Tell us about your 2020 book, Gender Trauma, and also tell us about the book, How to Understand Your Gender, and its companion zine.
I can. And I even co-authored a book called Life Isn't Binary. As non-shocker, given that I don't like boxes. Yes, I am an author. I still feel weird when I say that, but it's true because I have 5 books out and 3 under contract. So I guess I am a real author. So gender trauma, which actually has won 2 awards. It's won the Nautilus Award, Gold Seal last year, and then it won the ACKNOWLEDGMENT book for sexuality professional this year. Was published in 2020. it was a book that I carried in my head for a long time, if that makes sense.
Yes, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. I still feel weird saying things like that because the imposter syndrome in me still goes,
yes.
Yeah, but is it really that good?
Right. Yeah. Same here.
Exactly. And you know, people at home are like, well, you've now had two completely different and independent bodies look at this book and say it was good enough to give them an award. So there you go.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so, you know. But it was a book, I think partially is because it was a book that's so informed by my neurodivergence, right? It was like my brain kept making all those connections about gender and trauma. And I honestly wasn't sure if those connections would make any sense to anybody else outside of my brain. But one thing I knew very deeply was that for a lot of people, this rigid gender binary was really not only restrictive, but traumatic, and not only on an individual level, but on an historical level as part of the ongoing settler colonial project, you know, Christian supremacy, ongoing settler colonial project, you know, also how we cannot talk about gender without talking about race, because the way we're racialized is so connected to who is seen as having a legitimate, in air quote, gender or not, right? And so there were all these connections in my brain and in my work with clients and in my work when I was doing trainings, right? I kept hearing stories again and again of how people had been traumatized by the gender binary, either at school or on a family level or a cultural level. And so that's kind of what eventually brought the book about. You know, I talked about it. I kept writing the book proposal until my editor, literally, I remember I was at WisCon, which is a feminist science fiction convention. And I got an email from my editor at the time going, Alex, I need you to really write this proposal because somebody else has had proposed a book, which I don't think it's what you want to talk about. And I don't think it's very good. So I need you to write your proposal. And so I was like, okay, Andrew, I'm on it. You know, Ivor Focus kicked in. Got that proposal out in 24 hours, you know. And then I was like, oh God, now I got a contract. And then I got a contract with Jessica Kingsley. And I was like, oh God, I got to write it. And so I wrote it. It was actually a pretty challenging process because it is about the trauma of the gender binary from kind of this historical perspective in terms of how settler colonialism influences our current understanding of gender and how it erased and continues to erase and harm Indigenous folks all over the globe, as well as on Turtle Island, what we now call the US. And then, you know, went into, you know, impact on trans folks and impact on, you know, folks who are racialized, Black at various intersections, right? Black trans folks, Black cis folks, the impact of like family, the impact of purity culture. And so it was pretty hard sometimes. I had to just stop and grieve, for want of a better word, as I was writing this book, because there was so much pain, you know, like there's just so much pain and harm that has been perpetuated in the name of the gender binary. And that's what I wanted to point out. I wanted to point out the harm. And I also wanted to talk about the healing, though, right? If there's been all this harm, if we see this as a wound, you know, on a mental health level or on an educational level, how can we address that wound?
Right.
And so although the book is mainly for like therapists and educators, so there's like clinical vignettes and reflecting moments. I've also had people, members of the general public, read it and say they got quite a bit out of it. But my intention was to really put out there what was in my brain, show people what I thought that there was this pervasive wound. And until we, you know, if we don't acknowledge it, we can't address it. Right. And so that's ultimately what the book is about. And I don't know everything about how to fix it, but hopefully there are some ideas about how to engage with it, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes, it all makes sense. I'd like to dive into it, but in the interest of time, I've got two more questions that I want to ask you, and then one concluding question. But thank you for bringing that up. And again, the name of this book is called Gender Trauma. And another book is called How to Understand Your Gender. And Alex, what is the companion zine? Can you say that again, please?
Yes. If you go to my website, which is just alexiantaffi.com, Meg John Barker, who's my writing partner and co-author, we just made a zine out of the book so that it would be more accessible to people. And
Great.
How to Understand Your Gender, it was really written for cis folks. I know that trans and non-binary folks also have read it and gotten things out of it, but it's very much how do we break down all these ideas of gender as a biopsychosocial cultural phenomenon in a way that it's accessible for the general public, right? Because there was a lot of discourse in queer theory and feminist theory that is very inaccessible to the general reader, honestly, because it's kind of, I mean, I find Judith Butler a little hard to read, you know, and I have a PhD in gender studies. I was like, how do we make a lot of this information more accessible, which is one of my passions. And so that's How to Understand Your Gender came about. And then just last year, How to Understand Your Sexuality came out. And then Meg John and I are working on How to Understand Your Relationships. So there's going to be like a little triptych. And Meg John is really into making zines. And so they made a zine out of the book. And I'm hoping to also put some more zines on my website. I just wrote a little ebook about loving beyond binaries as well, which will be on my website this summer. So yeah, I just love putting stuff out there where people don't have to buy anything. They can just download it. And then they're like, oh, this seems worthwhile. Then they can buy the book. Yeah.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Second to the last question here. You also co-authored a zine titled Mapping Your Sexuality, which introduces readers to sexual configurations theory developed by Sari Van Anders. Can you briefly explain this theory? And we've got about 8 minutes. I still have 2 more questions to ask you plus promos.
So I will probably not explain the theory very well. Although,
okay.
So I encourage people to go and download the zine, which is actually now available in multiple languages, including Italian. So what happened was that Sari Van Anders, who's a professor, used to be University of Michigan. She's now in Canada. She's a feminist professor. And she came up with this beautiful theory, I think, which was not based on reproduction. So historically, a lot of the theories on human sexuality are very much reproductive based. They're not trans-inclusive. They're not inclusive of a wide range of sexuality. And so Sari was really trying to create a theory that better fit human experience, you know, rather than putting people in boxes, making the box almost customized for everybody. And so the idea with sexual configuration theory is, first of all, it challenges the dichotomy of sex and gender. In fact, Sari talks about sex/gender as all one. And really, so it really challenges this idea that of biological sex, in air quote, versus kind of gender identity. So put sex and gender together. And it then also divides sexuality between solo sexuality and partnered sexuality. And then it also talks about kind of discerning between eroticism in sexuality and nurturance. For example, for some people, the feeling of love and connection is completely separate from any feeling of pleasure or arousal. So there is no eroticism necessarily in their relationships. And Sari really believes that there should be a space in theories of human sexuality for folks who experience a nurturance-based sexuality versus an eroticism-based sexuality. And of course, we can also have both.
Right.
And she's the one who commissioned us and paid us to write the zine, which is freely available to anybody, because she has a commitment to making sexual configuration theory more accessible, which is just as wild because I had to read the paper like 15 times to understand what the theory was before we could write the zine. And it is not, it's a pretty dense theory, but I think it's beautiful because it really challenges everything we thought we knew about sexuality, and it is very inclusive of all gender identities, all sexuality. Is it perfect? No, definitely there are some flaws, but I think it's the best attempt we have to date of the non-reproductive based human sexuality theory. Sorry, I went a little academic there for a minute.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. The last kind of thing that I would like to ask you, if you're comfortable sharing that is, what terms do you use for your sexuality, and has that changed over your lifetime as well? We touched a little bit about it, but can we talk maybe about your pronouns and talk about like everything else, like as far as that too, if you're comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely. It's changed so much over time. Initially, I couldn't even, I know this is going to sound so weird, but I didn't even feel comfortable with the term genderqueer because all the queer people I knew were like very androgynous in their body, and my body was definitely not what I would categorized as an androgynous body. I had lots of curves. I was larger than most of the people I knew that were genderqueer, like in the UK where I was living at the time. And so there were some ways in which I didn't see myself in that community, if that makes sense. And so it took me a minute to really address that. I think the way I would describe, and I think my gender and sexuality go hand in hand. If I was totally unfiltered, and I know that this word has been used also as a harmful, hurtful term in queer community, but it's also a word that has been reclaimed by a lot of people, including older folks. But if I was really unfiltered, I would say I'm a trans faggot. That is my gender and sexuality. That's really the most accurate description.
Can you talk a little bit more about why that's an accurate description for you?
Yeah, because for me, in my understanding, my masculinity is so deeply queer. And so and my sexuality is mostly being attracted to masculinity, regardless of gender identity. And for me, there's something about the reclaiming of faggot, which is very much about a reclaiming of a shameless queer gender, right? If I think about the radical fairies, right? The radical fairies movement, which again, not perfect, and some radical fairies are trans exclusionary, though not all. It's always complicated, but there is something about being a faggot, which is very much about defying people's gendered expectations of you, right? I'm going to be myself. I'm going to wear clothes that maybe you consider too feminine because you read me as masculine. I'm going to put my earrings on. I'm going to wear makeup or not, right? There is kind of a shameless declaration of self. And it's also about people who don't pass. There's a certain ways in which I'm never going to pass as a trans man, not if I really want to be true to myself. And I think that's true for people who have been, even my cis gay man friends and brothers and family, like the ones who've been called faggots are the ones who couldn't hide their sexuality. And that's how I felt about my gender and sexuality, right? It cannot be hidden. This is who I am. And so for me, that's why it feels the most authentic. Now, I usually cannot really use it officially because it would require so much explanation.
Right. Which is why I asked you to explain.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. But I think for me, that's why it feels the most resonant. Because, if I had been born a cis man, I truly believe that would have been the kind of cis man that wouldn't have passed as like straight, right? That would have been like as too effeminate or not fitting into the box. In some ways. And I just feel this affinity. I spent a lot of time in gay male community in lots of different ways. And for me, often those are my people, the people I gravitate to, because we have some commonality of experience in different ways, but there is a commonality of experience too across our differences.
Well, spirits find each other and they create a spirit tribe. And that's what I really believe. And so that's why the whole kind of nonsense around what I consider nonsense around identity for myself speaking, I can't identify myself with these monikers. So I'm just a human being. And today I feel like this, tomorrow I feel like that, but I'm generally happy. I'm generally joyous. And that's all that really matters. And either you're with it or you're not. And that's okay either way. I'm still going to keep living.
Even when people are like, well, you have different pronouns, which one do you really like? And I'm like, it's more complicated than that.
It's so much more complicated. I have a name. Use my name.
Exactly.
Okay, we've got a few closers here. Is there anything we missed about neurodivergence, gender, and sexuality that you'd like to make sure you say?
Oh my God, probably a lot, because I could talk about this for like the next 20 hours.
Right. Well, we don't live too far from each other, so we're going to have to meet up.
Oh my God, yes, please. I'm like, we have so many things in common. I can hardly believe it.
Well, I've been meaning to get out there for a while. So yes, let's talk about that.
And visit, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that if there is something that I really want to say is exactly what we've been talking about, not putting people in boxes, right? I think we have expectations, right? Well, if you're trans, you need to do those things, or you need to experience gender dysphoria or euphoria, right? If you're neurodivergent, you need to present in this way. I was literally told by somebody, you can't have ADHD because you have a PhD. And I was like, I know so many PhDs with ADHD. What are you even talking about? Right. And so
how do you think we get those PhDs, honey?
Exactly. Like with our special interests. Exactly.
You need our neurodivergency. Quit it.
I was like, there's so many AUDHDers out there who are academics, right? And so I think for me, if there's one thing, it's just like, why do we have to keep trying to categorize? Which is why I never did that was one of the challenges for me in academia. That I could do research, but it's like, I am very wary of putting people in boxes. And so let's just make sure that we don't put each other into new boxes and that we don't police each other's gender boxes or neurodivergence just because we're afraid that other people will police us. And then we police ourselves first. And I'm like, it just makes me sad when I see that happening within our community. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
I do.
Are you really, in air quotes, trans? Are you really autistic, right? And I'm like, can we just not do that?
Can we not? Don't be patootie. Can we not?
Exactly. Also, you tell me, where is the line? Where do I stop being where does somebody stop being cisgender, right? When does somebody stop being autistic? Like, it's not like there's it's like geopolitical borders. They never made sense to me. I think cultural borders, sure, but geopolitical borders, terrible. And I feel the same around those kind of identities. When we police them, we are just buying into a carceral logic, which hurts us. And it's really something that I wish we could all move away from in community.
Yeah, it feels like a self-imposed incarceration for sure, I believe.
Yeah. And it's a form of assimilation. And I understand that it's about protecting ourselves in some ways. I truly don't think that's the way to protect ourselves in our communities.
Well, I mean, there's a matter you do need ego to protect yourself, but there's a difference between being having an ego and being egomaniacal. And then once you start branching off into egomaniacal behavior, then you're in the blame mode where you're blaming yourself, you're blaming everyone around you, and nothing will ever make you happy. Nothing will ever please you. And whatever you need to make you happy isn't outside of yourself. It's contained within. And so that requires silence and listening to the scary thoughts in your head and working with those, making friends with your fears and scary thoughts. Can you share an experience of gender euphoria?
Ooh, I probably can. It's a little challenging because I feel like I haven't gone anywhere much in the last 3 years. But
right.
But I really, actually, one of my favorite experience of gender euphoria was when many years ago, like 15 years ago, I think I went to Disney World for the first time in Florida.
Wow.
And I arrived, we went for a long weekend. I had this Groupons to stay at the Nickelodeon Hotel, and we got to the Nickelodeon Hotel, right?
Yes.
And, I went to check us in, and the person went, okay, and where is your wife? And I went, it's the 6'7" dude back there. That's my wife. Was, one of my partners of 23 years. And the face of the clerk was so beautiful. And I felt it was a moment of gender euphoria for me, because in a way, she was reading me as male and straight. And I just challenged that because it's like, that's my wife, the British tall dude over there. I mean, a 6'7", and that definitely stands out.
Nice.
Right, with my kid over there. And even though it was many years ago, that still makes me chuckle when I think about it. And I love when I can challenge people to think don't put me in a box. The box is so much bigger. Let's not make assumptions. And I'm doing it. I didn't want to humiliate her or make her feel bad. I hope that it was a humorous way to invite her to maybe not gender people so easily in the future.
Well, right. Like I'm not into shaming folks about it.
No,
It's you know, people
exactly.
are learning, you know, because not only were
Yeah,
we raised in a box, so was everybody else that's cisgendered and
exactly.
straight. And
Right.
so it's like sometimes you have to put up the emotional labor to do the even exchange to educate people, but also educating yourself on how to be able to educate people without shaming them. And that's
Exactly.
really key.
Exactly.
It's
Because
really
she was like,
key.
I'm sorry. And I was like, no, it's all good. Like, we're
Yeah.
fine. Not a problem at all. I
Right.
just thought it
Right.
was funny. And she was like, well, it kind of is a little bit funny. And then we laughed together. And it was great.
Yeah. That's it. You're learning and loving together. That's perfect. What
Yeah.
would you like to make sure folks know about your perspective on gender and non-binary trans issues?
Oh, that's great. I think that my perspective is often a little bit challenging because a lot of my ideas, and it's similarly with my writing partner, Meg John, go
Mm-hmm.
beyond just one community.
Mm-hmm.
Even life isn't binary. It's not just about non-binary folks. It's about how we can approach not just gender and sexuality in a non-binary way, but also
Mm-hmm.
relationships and bodies and thinking. And so for me, it's like my approach is very much about challenging any of those boxes, even the boxes between trans and cis and non-binary,
Mm-hmm.
and all those other boxes. Like, it's a lot of questioning. Do we need those boxes? Why do we need those boxes? And if we need those boxes, who gets to decide who's in the box and who's outside of the box, right? And so for me, it's really an invitation. And in a lot of my work, there is an invitation, first of all, not to other people, right? An
Yes.
invitation for everybody to think about their gender and sexuality, for example, not just trans and non-binary people, because we have to do it by default because we don't fit into normative ideas of gender. But I think
Mm-hmm.
everybody needs to look at we all need to look at our gender. We all need to look at the way our brains work. And
Mm-hmm.
does the way my brain works fit with normative ideas of how our brain should work or not?
Right.
And so I don't know, I think that is really at the heart of my work is challenging those boxes, challenging those binaries, challenging those borders, who I think are very artificial and very questionable.
I do agree with all of that. Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole nother. I've got a note
Yes.
here that we're plotting to bring you back because the community is loving the convo. I
Oh.
think it should be like a 2-hour thing because we have so many things to talk about.
I've done that sometimes when I record my episodes. Like, and now this is a 3-hour episode, which I've broken down in 3 parts because.
Right, come back for more.
Exactly. We love to do
Alex,
that.
thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a thrill. It was educational. It was a pleasure. It was pure joy, and it just made me very happy. And
Oh.
I'm going to do some cross promo for you here so we can make sure people know where to find you. Alex Iantaffi, PhD, MS, SEP, CST, LMFT, they, them, Louis, is a family therapist, WPATH certified gender specialist, an ACKNOWLEDGMENT certified sex therapist, somatic experiencing practitioner, clinical supervisor, and award-winning author. They have researched, presented, and published extensively on gender, disability, sexuality, and relationships. More information is available at alexiantaffi.com. And you'll see that pop up on your screen there if you're watching this. And socials, I'm assuming this is your Instagram at XTAFFI. And the Clowder query question is, and we came up with this today while we were prepping for the show. And so it's very strong. We're just going to let you know that now. So the content warning is strong. That's the content warning. How are you supporting yourself and those around you during this time of rising fascism?
Yeah,
That's
I was
right. You
trying
heard
to
it.
put it a different way, but I was like, that's really what I want to say.
I know,
Yes.
like I saw the way that you wanted to put it, which was, how are you assessing gender comfort and community in the midst of ongoing hostility towards trans, non-binary, and gender expansive people? And I looked at you and I was like, Alex, what was it you just want to say? And it came out, how are you supporting yourself and those around you during this time of rising fascism? I'm like, that's what we had to say.
Yeah, I was trying to modulate myself so it wasn't too much, and I love that.
Were you trying to get yourself in a box? We just talked about boxes for a whole hour.
I know. And then you read my very normative bio, like my work bio. And I was like, oh, I have so many feelings. We could talk about any one of those, but yes.
We'll bring you back and we'll do that. Okay, coming soon. Next week's guest will be they, them, and we are discussing the intersection of trans rights and racial justice. All right. We're going to go ahead and sign off on this. Thanks, everybody, for watching and for listening. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much for having me as a guest. So appreciated. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Genderful would like to thank our guest for being on this podcast. If you'd like to catch us live, join us on Mondays at twitch.tv/gendermaster. Show notes will appear in the edited version of the show on Fridays on both YouTube and podcasting platforms.
If you have a question you would like the host to answer or are gender diverse and would like to request an interview, please send an email to genderfulpodcast@gmail.com or sign up via the website at genderfulpodcast.com.
As a gender diverse community, the Clatter wants to assure our listeners that we are prepared to moderate our spaces. We will get positive and negative feedback on these shows and topics, and we have a moderation team on our channels, socials, and Discord server ready to deal with this.
Please join our Discord server at discord.gg/Meowster to meet the community and get a regular digest of Solidarity resources. You can also support us with subscriptions on Patreon, following and reviewing us on your favorite podcasting platform, or engaging with our posts and content on social media at GenderfulPod and at GenderMeowster.
You could take a few moments to also rate the show. We will post any 5-star reviews on our socials, so get creative. Mention a special interest of your own, a project you're working on, or even say hi to your comfort person in your review. What power!
This show is made possible by volunteers, tips, and subscriptions. Shout out to the folks helping us coordinate guests, edit the podcast, moderate the live chat, and post on our socials.
Artist credit for Genderful. Genderful's theme song is called Hope by Free Range Megs, aka Soma. The Gender Meowster logo was designed by That's Barnaby and edited with consent by Transgriffin. Genderful's pre-show is wrangled by JuiceTex. Genderful is edited and mixed by Transgriffin and Alexis Fandom. Genderful's social media is managed by Queer to Help. Genderful is hosted by Atlas O Phoenix and Gender Meowster. Genderful is the intellectual property of Gender Meowster. All rights reserved.
Trans rights are human rights. That's right.